I do hope you can see me today from where you are.
Ich bin ein Ehrlich.
If I'm generally anything, I guess I'm generally miserable. This modern world of science and invention is of particular interest to women.
The people, I would say, there is no patent. Would you patent the sun?
I regard myself as a soldier, though a soldier of peace.
Welcome to the Biographers.
It was rough, and like he was cracking on falsettos because he hasn't been taking care of his voice.
I mean, okay,
it was spicy, and now apparently he's been kind of an ass.
So from what I really wasn't of the age to live through it, but from what I understand, Sting from the Police did the same exact thing back in like the 90s, where it was even after, I don't know how much of a Sting fan you are, but after he left the Police, he kind of went on a bit of a tear and did really well for himself. And it all kind of came to this one album. I want to say it was, gosh, what was it called? I think it might have just been called Gold. I think is what it was called. But it had like, what's that one song called? Fields of Barley? Is that what it's called?
I think so. It's been a while.
Remember me when the west wind blows upon the fields of barley. It's a great song.
Yeah. That's a good one.
Really, really good. It makes me emotional because I used to listen to it when I was a kid with my parents in car trips and stuff like that. But apparently after that album, when he started to like get more into jazz and all this kind of stuff, that was all he would play at concerts. And people were like, bro, like, can't you just like at least play Roxanne? Like, please?
Yeah.
Like, come on. And he wouldn't do it because he was like, no, I'm moving forward, blah, 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 all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it took him a long time to figure out, like, come on, man, you got to give people what they want. Like, you got to give them the hits, right?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, to be fair, Brendan does play some songs from I Write Songs, Not
fair
Tragedies at the end of everyone.
Okay.
What's the one? Oh, well, imagine as I place in the views. What?
That was always one of my least favorite. There's, I chime in with the it's like, shut up. I don't know. I never liked that song
I bet you
particularly.
he's sick of it too because he's been playing it for 20 years now.
I honestly, I'm one of those weird people that 95% of the time, if I get into a band based off of anything really, I'll find that the radio hit, I go, why was this the hit? There are like 4 or 5 other songs that are so much better than this one, and I just don't understand why this one was like, oh, it's so good. Like, there were other ones that were way catchier, if you ask me. So, like Camisado, I remember was one of my absolute, can't take the gift from the boy, take the butt from the kid. Like, come on,
That's Fall Out Boy, right?
No, that's Panic.
Is that Panic? Jeez.
Yeah, dude. That was off the first album, man. Yeah. So, anyways, probably a good segue, not really at all, for us to say, welcome to the Biographers, everybody. My name is Daniel Newman, and with me is Akiva Miola.
Hi there.
And we're going to be getting back into Jack Daniel. This will be part 3.
I'm very excited. Our little boy is in the wasteland of post-Civil War United States, factions everywhere trying to steal his booze. We're going to see where he goes.
Yeah, man. He's getting back into it. He's getting into making his own thing, which I'm pretty excited to get into. I feel like the last few episodes were strangely light on the character of Jack Daniel. And I'll be honest, I have been like kind of re-editing through this series to make sure that it's where I want it to go and it's cohesive the way that I want it to be. And I kind of warned this at the beginning, but because there's so little records of really just general Appalachian day-to-day life, Jack Daniel was no exception to that. So like his first 25 to 30 years are relatively light on dense information about him. It's like, yeah, no, he was pretty much a normal guy and
I mean,
distilling whiskey. And then it eventually, like when he got more popular, that's when we started to really get into and know who this guy was.
Yeah,
you know?
it makes sense too, because once again, like we were talking about in the last episode, think about the society here. It's not like they're writing correspondence with one another because what is it, like 2/3 of them can't even write. So what is he writing letter? Who's he writing letters to?
Exactly.
You know, he's probably just worried about himself, worried about distilling, living in a rural area. There's no reason why he would be keeping a memoir.
And other people had no initial idea that he would be a character of American history. They were like, yeah, it's our local distiller.
Yeah, it's like, the booze boy, you know?
It's the guy that makes our booze. Who cares? So they weren't exactly saving his letters, you know, not often anyways.
Which reminds me of a small town thing. I lived up in Ellicott, Colorado, which is way out in the boonies. Like, you know, if you're in Colorado Springs and you try to head to Kansas and you run out of gas, that's probably where you're going to end up.
Okay.
And we used to have the story of Crazy Bob the Liquor Man.
Oh, now I got to know about Crazy Bob.
Yeah. So Crazy Bob was, in fact, crazy. And what it was a liquor store in the most loose of terms. What it was an RV that somebody had taken, plywood, Crazy Bob, I assume, and made it look like it was like a storefront. Like, think like an Old West set where, you know, it's just like one side of the building.
Yeah, totally.
And they just nailed it to this RV. And then like one of the windows, I assume at the front of the RV, was the drive-through window where you could get drive-through beer.
Gosh.
So when my dad would want to go get like a 6-pack of beer, we'd go over there and this crusty old man would get up out of what I assume is his bed at the RV and he'd go, "What do you want?" And we'd go, a six-pack of Coronas. And then he would take a 12-pack and with like a pocket knife, you'd just cut it in half and then hand us the rest.
That's awesome.
And you just like take and you're like, thanks. And
do you think he had an actual liquor license?
No, of course not. And we had one bar in Ellicott and the cops would go there too. And all of them, I assure you, did not call an Uber.
That's fair.
And he was right out by where we used to live. And apparently, and this is how the story goes. I feel bad for the family of Crazy Bob if they ever hear this, but the story goes that before he died or retired, we don't know what happened to him. Before he disappeared, he turned all of his money into cash or change and then just buried it in different holes along the property.
It's like Ron Swanson.
Literally, so that the kids would have to dig it up and like they pretty much had to like metal detect through the whole place so that they could find all the money that Crazy Bob had been stowing away. I assure you he did not pay the taxes on it.
That is really funny.
You know, exactly. You wouldn't expect Crazy Bob to have memoirs. So give Daniel a break if we don't have as much firsthand experience.
That's actually a pretty darn accurate way to kind of set it up as well. But that being said, we are going to be getting more progressively into the character of Jack Daniel. But I'll be honest with you, so much of the stuff that just happened around him in the world was also really, really fascinating too. So we're going to get into all that. So you ready to go?
Let's do it. I'm so excited. The scene is very strong with me right now.
Well, last time we saw a young Jack Daniel born to the Scotch-Irish immigrant community of the Appalachian Mountains in Tennessee and grow up in the age of the American Civil War. After becoming an orphan around age 15, Jack was put under the care of a local preacher and businessman named Dan Call. After working alongside Dan Call on his farm for a time, Jack was finally allowed to work as an apprentice brewer and distiller under the guidance of Dan Call's former slave, Nearest Green, more often called Uncle Nearest. Now, Jack took to the craft with enthusiasm and dedication, quickly gaining a strong grasp on the full process of making whiskey from corn, developed and taught to him, again, by Uncle Nearest. Spurred on to succeed by witnessing the devastation of the American Civil War during his upbringing, Jack now had his sights set on expanding the humble distillation operation to something he could truly hang his hat on. Moreover, Jack was starting to formulate a plan to establish a distillery of his very own. But in 1869, Ulysses S. Grant took office as President of the United States and was starting to push for a massive crackdown on illegal distilleries, especially in the South. So Dan Call decided to shut things down.
Oh, wait, shut down Jack Daniel's operation?
Well, remember, at this point, it's a tiny little distillation operation. It's Dan Call's,
I guess, yeah.
like 8, or was it 8
One
pot
wagon
still?
booze cruise, yeah.
Exactly. It was like not much of an operation yet. It was just him trying to sell whiskey around his area. Like it wasn't a whole lot. So when that started to happen, Dan was like, I really don't want somebody poking around, so I'm just going to call it quits for a while.
That's good on him for going by the books.
Yeah. Now for Dan, it just wasn't worth the risk anymore. But Dan knew that Jack's heart was now bound to whiskey making, not farming, and didn't want to force a future onto him. Amazingly, in March of that same year, 1869, 2 Civil War vets named Colonel John Mason Hughes and Jack Eaton, along with a distiller named Ben Tolley, leased a fairly large piece of property from Dan Call in Lynchburg for the purposes of starting their own distillery. Now, interesting little sidebar here. Jack Eaton was actually the son of a legendary distiller named Alfred Eaton, who is historically known as the first person to filter his whiskey through charcoal and thus creating the Lincoln County process. So this is his son.
Wow.
Right? That was starting this distillery. Now, Dan told the group about Jack's natural talent and drive and asked the group if they could take him on as an employee, to which they agreed. Now, thankfully, Jack's sister Nettie was now living in Lynchburg on a 140-acre plot of land with her new husband, Felix Motlow, and they agreed to let Jack stay with them. This resulted in Jack developing a tight bond with both Nettie and Felix, along with their children. In fact, the year Jack moved into their house was the same year they had their first son, Lemuel Motlow, who, very much under the guidance and influence of his uncle Jack, would later become a master distiller and one day owner of the Jack Daniel's distillery.
Wow. Keeping it in the family. Well, I guess kind of family.
It is the South.
Yeah.
Oh!
Who knows?
Now, we'll talk more about Lem Motlow a bit more throughout this series, but definitely for a hot minute in the last episode, so stay tuned for that. Now, though his career path seemed to be lining up, behind the scenes, all was not well amongst the Daniel family. After Jack's father Calloway died in 1867, the family farm was sold for just over $7,500, which equates to about $155,000 in today's currency.
How big was the farm? Do you know?
It was like 140 acres, 150 acres, something like that. A little bit more. It's really funny. Throughout all this research, I find that it's like the most common landmass people would have and buy was 140 acres. And I had to like go back and check a bunch of times. I was like, really? They had 140 acres? They had 140 acres? Like all of them had 140 acres. I don't know what it was, but it was like...
It's probably just a population thing, you know?
Might have been.
I don't know what the population was, but I imagine it's a fraction of what we have now.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, because 50 acres is considered pretty solid for any home farm these days.
Oh yeah, and 140 acres, that's a big piece of land,
That's
man.
gigantic.
That's really,
like,
really big.
You're like 1% of the farming community if you got that size there.
Totally. Now, the profits from selling the farm, according to Calloway's will, was to be distributed equally amongst the children. But the younger Daniel children, including Jack and Nettie, argued that Calloway, their father, had given the older children a whole bunch of valuable family heirlooms prior to his death. This meant, according to the younger siblings, that the older siblings were entitled to less of the profits from the sale of the family farm.
Yikes.
I know, a little will dispute here.
Mm-hmm.
Now, eventually, in 1869, the kids all took each other to court, and a fairly ugly legal battle ensued. But Jack stood to inherit more than $1,000 if the case went their way, and he was desperate for the extra cash, as he had big plans to start his own distillery.
That'd be a solid nest egg there.
Totally. But during the period of 1868 to 1874, just over 6 years, Jack worked for the Tolley and Eaton distillery, mostly working in sales and distribution, but also paying close attention and providing help where he could in the whiskey-making process. But most importantly, Jack had been learning the actual business of whiskey, the legal business, that is. In the summer of 1874, the Daniel family inheritance court case was finally settled, and Jack walked away with a cool $1,000, converting to just over $30,000 in today's currency.
Ooh.
Pretty nice. Then, in 1875, a massive hailstorm blasted through the area and reportedly destroyed more than 500 barrels of Tolley and Eaton's whiskey supply.
Oh, geez.
Though Jack didn't exactly delight in the bad fortune of his employer, he did see the opportunity, as his sense for business had been getting sharper and sharper. The time was finally right. At age 25, Jack was now ready to pull the trigger and start his own distillery. But before he could go all in, Jack knew he needed to make some changes first. So now we get to the point in our movie where the protagonist sheds off their old nerdy garb, goes on a shopping spree, gets a haircut, and sings, "You're the one that I want," with John Travolta. I'm kind of not even kidding, okay? If he was going to be seen as a high-class businessman, Jack knew he needed to change his image. The baby-faced, rugged country look would never work for the refined image he had in mind for his whiskey brand. To make his transformation real, Jack left town for a few weeks. Nobody quite knows where he went for sure, but if I was a betting man, I'd wager he went down to Nashville. But again, we don't know. But during this trip, he grew out his facial hair and groomed it into a flowing mustache and precise goatee. He trimmed up his hair, combed it into a thin little part, and maybe most importantly, he changed his attire. Gone were the days of dirty workers' clothes. Jack now sported a cream-colored silk vest over a crisp, white-collared shirt and a broad ascot necktie.
I'm picturing that professor from Waterboy.
A little bit, yeah.
A little bit of Colonel Sanders type energy.
A little bit.
Southern gentleman.
Very much a Southern gentleman. And there are pictures, by the way, of Jack Daniel, I think even on some of the Jack Daniel bottles. So it's not like a lost image. We have a very clear image of what he looked like, and I'll show you after this if you're curious to know. Now, to bring the entire look together, he added a dark, knee-length gentleman's coat and a swoopy white Western-style hat. The look, in his mind, of a refined whiskey baron.
Ooh.
Now, once Jack finished his transformation from ugly duckling to Swan, he returned to Lynchburg and once again tapped on the shoulder of his old mentor, Dan Call. Not only was Dan an amazing resource for all things business and a well-respected figure in the scene of local distilling, but Jack knew he could reliably count on the quality of Dan's corn crop. Dan didn't take much convincing to become Jack's partner, and once hands were shaken, they founded a new distillery called simply Daniel and Call. Pretty straightforward.
I thought it'd be Jack Daniels by now, but
Ooh, no, we're not there yet. That's not for another couple years. Now, with this new partnership form, expansion was imminent, which meant the days of small batch distilling from the little 8-gallon still were done. Their new operation was now capable of producing almost 100 gallons of whiskey per day.
wow. And this operation, was this the previous building from his employers that had the hailstorm? Okay.
No, not the same. From not the ones that had the hailstorm. This is now back on Dan Call's property.
Oh, okay.
In like I think in out of a barn or something like that. At this point, I wasn't exactly sure where they started distilling out of. I know that it was in Lynchburg, but I don't know what building specifically. I just know that it was on Dan Call's property because he was a fairly large and prominent like landowner at the time.
Okay, yeah. Because I was about to say that's a massive still, comparatively speaking.
So strangely, it's at this point we're not even to the quote-unquote big scale distillation, and we'll get there in a little bit, but this is, at least by comparison, going from 8 gallons a day to 100 gallons
Over
a day.
10 times bigger, yeah.
We're still doing pretty well for ourselves. Now, such was the scope of their operation that it now required the help of 6 employees, and wouldn't you know it, both Jack and Dan agreed that old Uncle Nearest was to be among them, undoubtedly acting as the authoritative voice of daily distilling.
Nice.
Now, Jack Daniel had finally gone legit with a legal and taxable whiskey business. His products were no longer moonshine. He was officially making above-board whiskey, Tennessee whiskey, if you want to be precise. The date was November 27th, 1875, the official date that Jack Daniel began legally making whiskey in Tennessee. It's important to note, though, that Jack never lost his dedication for quality and was known to taste every single barrel of whiskey before it was shipped out. I should also clarify on that. He, again, was not... He liked to drink, but he wasn't like an alcoholic lush or anything like that. He was known to literally take like a dropper and drop it onto his tongue to taste from the barrel, and then he would cleanse his palate afterwards and go on to the next barrel.
Huh. Well, I mean, that's probably a good sign. It's kind of like if ever worked in a restaurant, like the last thing you want to do is have a whole plate of your own food. You just want to make sure that it tastes good,
right?
You know?
And that was his whole thing, is that he was like, I don't want to burn off my taste buds while I'm just like shot after shot after shot of whiskey. He's like, literally, I just want to like get the flavor and make sure there aren't any notes that I didn't like, or it just didn't go right, or maybe it needs to be distilled again. Again, he just wanted to make sure it was all kosher.
Yeah,
you know?
and I guess if he was a drunk, we wouldn't really, maybe we wouldn't even know his name, because I think that clear mind probably helped him in the business sense.
Yeah, he had a sense for the actual business itself, not just the drink. So definitely helpful. Now, Jack had finally done it. He was now the proud owner of his very own distillery, joining the ranks of his heroes and mentor. Things were going well. Everyone in the area already knew Jack from his previous years of selling whiskey from his donkey wagon, and were not only huge fans of him as a person, but even bigger fans of his delicious whiskey. Now, Jack found that once he had his own label on his own jugs of whiskey, people responded with enthusiasm. His customer base was already there, and all he needed to do was show up for them.
Well, now he's the hometown hero, so...
Exactly. They were like, and they imagine watching this little guy go from like, you know, basically wearing like, not necessarily rags, but look, country outfit, right? Overalls, I'm sure, something like that. No shirt, little straw out of his mouth or whatever, right? Kind of dirty. And now he's like this dressed to the nines dude who's like, now I'm selling whiskey to saloons all over the place. You can grab my stuff anywhere. Like,
yeah, you could be like, yeah, I actually knew Jack, and like I tasted his whiskey before he was popular, you know.
It was cool. Hipsters of whiskey. It also seems that the people had a deep sense of pride in Jack, having watched him grow, again from the Boy Distiller, I already wrote this down, to a bona fide man of whiskey. Now that Jack had a steady stream of income, he bought some land of his own, some 140 acres.
There we go.
Happily located right next to Dan Call. The house on the land boasted 10 rooms, with a barn, an outhouse, and tenant house also located on the property. After living a life of poverty, Jack had achieved the American dream by becoming a self-made person.
How old was he at this point?
25.
I'm so mad right now.
I
I'm
know,
24, and I don't think I have 1/16 of an acre. I don't have any acres, actually. I rent. Never mind.
I thought that's just like amazing, though. But this was only the beginning, as he wasn't the only game in town when it came to strong drink. The old blood of the area refused to go quietly even after the hailstorm had almost ruined them. But Jack was a force to be reckoned with and was always good with staying up on the latest and greatest trends and technology for making spirits. Like all technology, things progressed step by step. The first innovation was with what's known as the semi-continuous process, the science of which I won't get into, but as the name implies, it allowed for semi-continuous whiskey brewing and distillation. So just a lot more scale.
As opposed to having to refill the batch all the time.
Exactly. You can kind of add to it, and then it would just kind of keep going, and then it would only have to stop at limited amounts of time. So you could be a lot more efficient with how you were making your product, basically.
Yeah.
Another massive innovation was the 3-chamber distillation system, where 3 separate chambers were connected and allowed for whiskey to be triple distilled all in one go, rather than in 3 separate distillation runs. So for anybody, I don't think I've ever mentioned this to you, but there was a very brief period of time where I worked at a distillery.
Really?
Yeah. I won't get into it because it didn't end very well.
Okay.
But I worked at this distillery, and the actual still that he used, it was on site. We could see it. It was gorgeous. Same thing, except I think his was like a 4-chamber distillation system where it just like one after the other would go from one chamber to the next, distilling up all the alcohol. It was pretty darn neat.
Yeah. And folks, if you guys have never been to a distillery or anything like that, it really still feels like it could have happened 200 years ago. It's such like a mad scientist laboratory looking place. All these chambers, and that you have to have special welders making all of these different containers and chamber pots and all this stuff.
It reminds me of steampunk.
Yes, it's very steampunky.
It's like the look of it. There are like little gauges on it and stuff to where it's like, oh, the pressure's too high. Got to blah blah blah.
Yeah,
it's very very cool.
Very very mad science.
Now, the actual scale of everything was getting bigger too, as some of these triple chamber stills were reportedly reaching upwards of 4 stories.
Wow.
Structures that now competed with the quote-unquote skyscrapers of the day. Remember, this is back in the...
No, I mean, 4 stories is still a lot for, hammer and nails.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking about right now, my house is 2 stories, and I'm like, okay, double that, and that's the size of a distillation still? Like, that's pretty amazing. It's
gigantic.
Huge, right? Now, these increases in size also increased the danger, and some local competitors who weren't quite as disciplined in their distilling saw massive explosions and fires.
Yeah, kind of like we were talking about. If you're heating up alcohol, it's
and now you're
so
just doing
close.
it on a much, much bigger scale. It's not just like, oh no, I got hurt. It's like there are literally stories of like city blocks burning down because these stills were not managed correctly and they exploded and created fires, and it's just like it can be a really, really nasty situation.
Yeah, you could ruin a whole town.
So again, things were going quite well for Jack at this point. But all was not well, however, when it came to the overall stability of America's economic situation. in the United States, I was taught growing up that the stock market collapse of 1929, which led to the Great Depression, was the first time the U.S. saw this kind of event take place, but that turns out to not be true at all.
Really?
In 1873, J. Cook and Company, an investment banking firm most known for funding the Santa Fe Railroad, went under. As a result, the public panicked, pulled all of their money from the other major investment banks, and before you knew it, the U.S. had its first depression.
Interesting. Well, I guess that's probably even worse because there were massive monopolies at the time too. So,
oh, and we're gonna get into that. I don't know about this episode, but maybe next episode. Yes, we're gonna talk all about monopolies and all that kind of stuff too. So,
cool.
Overnight, around the area of Lynchburg, the price of eggs dropped from 20 cents per dozen to just 8 cents per dozen.
Yikes.
So huge drop. Again, this was 1873. Luckily, Jack was relatively unaffected by this financially, as he had discovered the relative depression-proof business of making whiskey.
Yeah, happy or sad, there's always a reason to drink, I guess.
And that, funny you say that, because this was coupled with the fact that he kept his money in a private safe rather than a bank. In fact, the economic depression seemed to work slightly to his benefit, as when the time arrived to buy his 140-acre piece of property, he found he could buy the entire lot for under $1,000.
Yeah, there's something to be said about keeping that money under a mattress. You know, that is still a very Southern thing to do.
Oh yeah, and we're actually going to talk about that too, the kind of like the money situation of the times. I won't give it away just yet. But the town of Lynchburg wasn't so lucky. An economic depression meant a massive increase in crimes, and probably most detrimentally, a massive increase in the trafficking of opium in the region.
Oh,
yeah.
I didn't even know that there was. I guess, yeah, that does make sense. There was opium at the time, huh?
Mm-hmm. And the echoes of this can still be felt to this day. Yes, the opiate crisis in the Appalachian Mountains is not a new development, but something that started over 150 years ago, all tied back to an economic depression caused by bad investment banking.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because there's also still the substance abuse. There's so many things, you know, I find it really interesting when people say that a event happened at this time, because there's really no stopping of events. The gears just turn a little bit slower. You know, we still feel effects of the Vietnam War. Native Americans still felt the effects of firewater from this time. You know,
it reminds me of one of the reasons, you know, that I kind of got started making this podcast is that I listened to a ton of true crime podcasts. Mm-hmm. And my favorite true crime podcast, Last Podcast on the Left, shout out to you guys. They have said it many times over where they're like, you know, people will go, why true crime now? Why is it so popular right now? And it's like, no. It's always been popular.
Yeah, 100%.
Violence and crime has always been popular. And the more that they go back into these stories from the turn of the century and stuff like that, I mean, there are literally stories of this horrible serial killer back in the day, Albert Fish. When he was initially caught, people tried to like steal bits of his body as souvenirs. So it's like this. No. True crime isn't just starting to be a thing now. It has always been a thing. And to me, it's just really interesting when it ties back to this, where it feels like the conversation around opioid addiction is like it's just starting. Oh, how did this just happen? Oh, man, we just can't get a handle on this. And it's like, the more we go back, dude, this started in the Appalachians alone over 150 years ago. Yeah. Which is an intense thought.
Yeah,
you know?
I mean, governments and populations have been using drugs to sedate people that they didn't like since, hundreds of years before we even knew what penicillin was.
Totally. Now, such was the rampant nature of the opium outbreak that the Lynchburg Sentinel, the local paper, posted weekly ads desperately pleading for someone to come and help cure the opium addiction that now plagued the area. Maybe most terrible of all, the economic depression brought a massive resurgence of racism amongst the white people of Lynchburg. To make matters worse, when Rutherford B. Hayes eventually took over as president in 1877, he quickly abandoned the notion of Reconstruction in the South, subsequently removing all federal troops, which left the black community of the area exponentially more vulnerable to hate crimes.
Yeah, we don't need a town named Lynchburg to be more racist.
Yeah, and it wasn't just Lynchburg. It was, look, it's the Deep South, and it was all over the place. But yeah, Rutherford B. Hayes was like, nah, we're good. And then it just kind of opened the door for all of these people to do terrible things.
Yeah. And you were already talking about, even when he was a kid, how dangerous everything was in a post-war world.
And it was like getting slightly better because it was like, we're trying to do things. We're trying to do things. And then Rutherford B. Hayes comes in and goes like, yeah, we're good. And just basically hits the reset button. It was
no reparations,
ridiculous.
nothing.
However, the issue most affecting Jack at this point was the growing influence of the temperance movement in the United States, which was leading to an influx of new laws and regulations surrounding liquor. Now, temperance, for those not familiar, really just means saying no to drinking at all. Or if you were raised in the 90s or 2000s, you'd call it straight edge. Is that what you guys called it too?
Yeah, straight edge.
Now, various clubs and societies were formed over the years to shout for the cause of temperance, with names like the Sons of Temperance, the Cold Water Brigade, and the Children of Drunkards, which is my favorite. A common phrase used by all was, quote, "The man takes the drink, then the drink takes the man."
Ooh, that's actually pretty catchy.
It is pretty
what?
catchy.
Maybe I'd look at the flyer.
Credit where credit's due on that one. Whoever thought that up was like, ooh, that's a good one. Now, moreover, the temperance fighters were gaining serious ground as the collective towns of Kentucky had recently voted against issuing any new liquor licenses in the state by a vote of 207 to 52.
Yikes. Wow. Even in the South, it's that overwhelming.
Dude, never underestimate the influence of, I'll broaden it and say religion when it comes to influence, right?
That's true. That's true.
That was very much what was happening here. Now, this sentiment went all the way up to the White House, as First Lady Lucy Webb Hayes was so keen to abolish liquor that she had banned it from the White House altogether, and even earned herself the nickname Lemonade Lucy.
It just cracks me up too, because we're still talking about a post-Civil War. So they're like, racism I can excuse, but drinking, no thank you.
It's so true.
It's like, you can excuse racism? I'm thinking of Community. I'm not sure if you remember that one.
So I haven't been able to get into Community because I knew Allison Brie growing up. I think I told you that. She was my brother's friend. And so it's just always been really strange to watch her in anything because I'm like, oh, it's Allison Skirmerhorn.
That's so funny. That's so funny. But there's basically a scene where some guy says, or some girl says, racism I can excuse, but I stand my ground on animal cruelty. And Black girl with the left was like, wait, you can excuse racism? That's kind of the same thing here with drinking.
That's pretty darn funny. And it's weird. I didn't even strangely thought I've connected those two dots of being like, wow, what are you guys prioritizing here? It's insane. Now, Jack was currently safe in Tennessee, as the governor had vetoed a similar regulation to Kentucky's in 1876. But it was becoming increasingly clear to the young distiller that regulation on liquor would eventually catch up. Some distillers were already feeling the noose tighten, as in 1877, Tennessee enacted the 4-mile law, which forbade any distillery to operate within 4 miles of a schoolhouse in any unincorporated town.
That is seriously restrictive. 4 miles.
4 miles.
And also think about the transportation, these days. You're expecting people with horse and buggy to be that far out of town.
Totally. But again, Jack got lucky being located in the recently incorporated Lynchburg. So that was the loophole to this entire situation. If your town was incorporated, that didn't apply. But if your town was unincorporated, you cannot operate within 4 miles of the schoolhouse.
Okay.
So Jack got lucky on that one.
He seems to have just managed to dodge so many bullets already so far.
Honestly, it's one of those things where I can't remember what the exact phrasing of this whole thing is, but it's like success is when luck meets opportunity.
Yeah,
right?
100%.
That is almost the definition of Jack Daniel's existence.
Yeah,
it's like, dude, you got so lucky so many times.
Born in the least educated, worst part of America, at arguably one of the most violent and worst times, and yet he's managed to, by 25, accrue 100 acres of land, managed to own his own business, keep it legal, even in the middle of a culture that was trying to, throw whiskey out the window.
Right, and somehow throughout all these different regulations being passed, they were like, oh, that all applies to you, but somehow, Jack, it doesn't apply to you.
Wow.
It's amazing. Now, as the years progressed, however, the one area where Jack wasn't so lucky was with his longtime partner, Dan Call, whose Lutheran beliefs were causing an increasing amount of inner turmoil regarding alcohol. However, the true big bad wolf for Jack wasn't the temperance fighters, but the tax man. See, Jack had finally gone legit, meaning he was no longer a moonshiner, but a right proper distiller, which meant he had to keep the books and pay the man. At this point in American history, the head of the Internal Revenue Service was an ex-Union Civil War vet named General Greenberry Rom, and he fancied himself quite the connoisseur of fine spirits, whiskey and bourbon in particular.
Greenberry is also such. I think is what you said on. I think it was another episode where you're like, if it's two first names, then it's strong, because Greenberry doesn't even sound that cool, but it's Greenberry, General Greenberry. I don't know.
Greenberry Rom. His middle name was Rom, or pardon, Barry, and his last name was Rom. So a lot of times I just refer to him as General Rom, or it might be Raum. R-A-U-M. R-A-U-M.
Oh, okay.
So if somebody out there, if a pronunciation police officer is listening, hey, if you know the true way to pronounce this general's last name,
correct us.
Hit us up, biographerspodcast@gmail.com. Now, according to General Rom's quote-unquote expertise, and this is important, every bushel of corn that a bourbon maker used should yield 3 gallons of product. And a bushel of corn is 60 pounds, by the way. So he's basically saying for every 60 pounds, every single whiskey maker across the board should be able to make 3 gallons of whiskey. Okay? This might be well and good for most quote-unquote normal distillers in the Appalachians, but not for the artisans of the Lincoln County process, who filtered their end product through a charcoal filter. That extra step reduced their end yield to just 2.5 gallons of spirit per bushel of corn, not 3.
Gotcha.
In other words, Tennessee whiskey makers sacrificed volume for quality. But this didn't matter to General Rom, and many of the original distilleries that helped to make the Lincoln County process the art form that it is shut down. For some reason, General Rom really seemed to have it out for the Tennessee distilleries that utilized the Lincoln County process in particular. Now, why do I say this? Well, in order to whip them all into shape and really keep them under his thumb, in March of 1877, General Rom ordered that Lynchburg be the new permanent office of Deputy Revenue Collector Colonel J.W.C. Bryant. This effectively meant they had Big Brother constantly looking over their shoulders now.
Yikes.
I know. Things got so bad for the Lynchburg area distillers that the legendary distillery of Tolley and Eaton, Jack's old employer, had gone under and was now selling all of their land and assets.
This could be an opportunity for Jack.
Potentially, but check this out. Now, it might not seem like much, but for a small local economy, this was going to be a heavy blow, as Tolley and Eaton bought massive amounts of extra corn from surrounding farmers, large quantities of material from local manufacturers to make barrels, and employed many local workers. So it wasn't just like, oh, shut down the whiskey. It was like, you're kind of taking away tons of business from everybody by doing this, you know?
You're shattering the town.
Exactly. Now, if we were to give a little bit of credit to the tax man, I will say that though the government officials surrounding the whiskey industry were corrupt as hell at the time, they did do studies and found that only 30% of all alcohol being made in the US was being tracked and taxed. I did the math on it, and it equates to somewhere between 10 to 54 million gallons of moonshine per year that was being illegally produced in the United States at the time, which again, this is around 1875. Now, if you remember, in episode 1 of this series, I talked pretty extensively about the Scotch-Irish population that mostly inhabited the Appalachian Mountains and how they all shared the same core values of freedom and whiskey. Though I am no fan of his, I do think General Rom painted a pretty amazing picture of the overall atmosphere and attitude of moonshiners in the Appalachians when he wrote in 1877, quote, "The extent of these frauds would startle belief. They are usually located at inaccessible points in the mountains away from the ordinary lines of travel and are generally owned by unlettered men of desperate character, armed and ready to resist the laws of office."
Hell yeah, brother.
When occasion requires, they come together in companies of from 10 to 50 persons, guns in hand, to drive the officers out of the country. They resist as long as resistance is possible, and when their stills are seized and they themselves are arrested, they plead ignorance and poverty, and at once crave the pardon of the government. So in other words, there were a lot of people who weren't paying their fair share, and when the government nailed them on it, they all tried to weasel their way out of it.
You know what? To be fair, they just pulled out so many tax benefits and tax services with this new president coming along. It's like, why would you pay the taxes? They're not building roads. They're not helping anybody. You know, I can, once again, it's that culture of distrust of like, I'm going to take care of my own. Don't worry about me.
It's true. It's true. But it is funny that when they're like, again, when he says it, he's like, when we actually get them, oh, they plead ignorance and then we're poor and please let us go. Oh, I'm so sorry. And
I'm just a little guy.
Exactly. And it is one of those where it's like, all right, guys, come on, kind of own up. Like a little bit, you know?
It's like, I literally saw you distilling moonshine right by that creek over there.
You know that this isn't okay. You know you're supposed to have this taxed. And it's like not an insane tax either. It's just tax. So like, come on, help us out.
I can't spell tax, please.
But still, this was all too much for the Lynchburg distillers, who decided it was high time to meet up as a group and discuss their options. The group of Lynchburg distillers consisted of 6 companies: Tolley and Eaton, Hughes & Co., Hiles and Berry, Daniel and Call, Pitts, Parks and Brandy, and J.T. Motlow. During their first meeting, all of the distillers shared their production figures and collectively agreed that their process all separately yielded 2.5 gallons of spirit per bushel of corn, not 3. This was no longer a matter of opinion, it was a matter of fact. The Lincoln County process sacrificed some of its volume for quality.
Yeah.
So as a group, the distilleries drafted a letter to General Rahm listing their grievances. First was the rezoning of their tax district. Previously, and this is important, okay, so everybody remember this, right? This is about a tax. I know it sounds strange. It's about a tax district, but I promise this is actually important, okay? Now, previously, Lynchburg was labeled as Tennessee District Number 4, and as company brands were quickly becoming more and more important to consumers, Tennessee District Number 4 actually meant something to their customers. But in 1876, General Rahm had combined Lynchburg into Nashville, which now put all of them under the umbrella of Tennessee District Number 5. This was no good, as District Number 5 already had its own set of loyal customers, and the OG District Number 4 distillers didn't want to be associated with the sweet mash makers of Nashville.
Okay.
Right?
So, like on the bottles, would they like write like, oh, this is from District Number 4 or something like that? Was this like a marketing thing, or was it just?
We're still in the age of barrels. Glass,
Gotcha.
And we're going to talk about this later, but glass bottles didn't become a thing for another like 10 or so years. So we're still at the point of jugs and barrels. That's like what's being sold to people. But yes, that literally they would know these distilleries as part of certain districts. We hadn't. No, I think we actually might be at the point now where all of these distilleries are registered. Yeah, they are. And have their own numbers assigned to them as well. Okay, So again, it did matter. And in Nashville, like I said a second ago, they were mostly known for making sweet mash. We talked about that in episode 2, I believe, where sweet mash, it's basically you make your more or less beer, and that's it. You distill it, right? The sour mash, which is what they were doing in Lynchburg, it's more of that sourdough style where you use some of the old mash, you add it to the new batch, and it kind of creates its own flavor profile. Okay. So again, this is really important. District 5 represented sweet mash. District 4 represented sour mash. So they were like, no, dude, we can't be the same. It's not the same thing. It's like saying rye and bourbon are the same, and they're not the same thing, right? So they wanted that to change. Now, their second big issue was in competition. Nashville was home to 2 of the largest distilleries at the time, belonging respectively to Charles Nelson and John Woodard. Charles Nelson's distillery was capable of producing over 380,000 gallons of bourbon per year, while even the largest distillery in Lynchburg, Tolley and Eaton, could produce only 30,000 gallons per year.
Wow, that is serious competition now that they're put in the same district.
Huge disparity. Because Nelson dominated so much of the market, he could easily keep up with the demands for the latest and greatest technology to aid in his expansion, while most of the Lynchburg distilleries could not. You could probably understand that when you're like, that guy's got a better power hammer than me.
Yeah, 100%.
Which is not true for you because you have great power hammers.
Yeah, we got a great shop.
Now, lastly, they simply could not keep up with the demand that a single bushel of corn could produce 3 gallons, and definitely not in the 3-day fermentation time that General Rahm was demanding. In Nashville, again, they made sweet mash, which could easily be fermented in 3 days, but Lynchburg did sour mash, which usually needed 4 to 5 days. General Rahm had managed to create such a nasty web of legal red tape that simply running a distillery efficiently or even profitably was becoming nearly impossible. Now, together, they wrote a formal letter to the Commissioner of the Office of Internal Revenue Services that began by saying, quote, "We earnestly protest against the longer continuance of these consolidations. These and other similar established facts which have come into our possession compel us to conclude that it is the intention of the U.S. government to crush out entirely the sour mash business. We sincerely think it a manifest breach of faith as between us and the government, though it may be to the interest of sweet mash distilleries in the 5th District of Tennessee, who are thus enriched at our expense."
Ooh, do we know if the general was lining any pockets with sweet mash money?
Ooh, buddy. We're going to get there a little bit later, but suffice to say for now, yeah, General Rahm was not a clean-nosed man, let's say. He was a bit of a dirty guy. Now, this letter was then to be hand-delivered to General Rahm in Washington so as to show the seriousness of their tone. If Jack and his fellow sour mash distillers wanted to keep producing their spirit, they would either need to get the government to change, resort back to their old ways of moonshining, or find a new way to adapt. But the key to remember for the times: corruption. In case we need a time period check, we're in early 1877, which means that the current sitting president of the United States is Ulysses S. Grant. Rutherford B. Hayes would be sworn in as president in March of 1877, so it's just like a few months of 1877 that Ulysses S. Grant was still in power.
Yeah.
Now, I'd be willing to bet that most Americans know 2 primary facts about Ulysses S. Grant. 1, he was the general that led the Union armies to victory in the Civil War, and 2, he was a lousy drunk. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know that at all.
Oh, Grant's drunken ways were so widely known that when Abraham Lincoln was pressed on the issue by reporters, he responded by saying, quote, "I wish some of you would tell me the brand of whiskey that Grant drinks. I should like to send a barrel of it to my other generals." He's basically saying he's doing a great job as a drunk man, so if that's the key, I'll send it to whoever. I don't even care.
Drunk or no, he has results.
Right. Abe Lincoln was like, dude, whatever. Let the man drink. If he's going to win me the war, go for it. I don't care. Like, if there's something in the water, let me send it wherever it needs to go.
That's what we call a working alcoholic.
Now, sadly, legend has it that old Ulysses' brand of whiskey was not Jack Daniels, but Old Crow. Regardless, Grant was a man of the drink. Whether or not intentional, during his time as president, Grant had appointed a number of government positions to his old war buddies, like General John McDonald, who was appointed as revenue collector in St. Louis, Missouri. Once in office, John McDonald started accepting bribes and diverting tax revenue away from government collections and into the pockets of various government authorities who were keen to abuse the system.
Okay. So that's beginning to make sense. We have 800,000 barrels versus, not even a fraction of that.
Right.
There's definitely some money involved.
Absolutely. Now, eventually, this whole operation was figured out and became known as the Whiskey Ring. There's a lot more detail to it, but suffice it to say, this scandal went all the way up to the IRS and the White House. General Green B. Rahm, the head of the IRS at the time, claimed he had nothing to do with the Whiskey Ring conspiracy, but everyone knew better, and very few people trusted him.
Yeah.
You called that one.
No, 100%.
Now, this was the man that Jack Daniels' compatriot distillers were going to visit and to whom they would deliver their letter. To put it mildly, Jack and his fellow distillers failed in their task.
Oh.
Though they were able to speak with General Rom directly, their letter and conversation did nothing to implement the changes they desired. They would be stuck with Rom for the duration of his term, which still had another 7 years to go.
Yeah, it's we have a scale, and on one hand we have thousands and thousands of dollars from a whiskey industry, and on the other hand we have a strongly worded letter by a couple of Southern gentlemen. I think.
Well said. Well said.
Yeah, we got Yelp review or cold hard cash.
That's pretty funny. The only real victory that the distiller community achieved was with the 1880 amendment of the excise tax on whiskey. Up until then, the government was taxing distillers based on how much spirit was being added to a barrel after distillation. In other words, they were taxing full barrels of whiskey.
Gotcha.
The problem with this is what's referred to as the angel's share, or the angel's portion, as some people call it. See, when whiskey is aged in barrels, about 10% of the volume evaporates out of the barrel within the first year, and about 5% is lost every subsequent year. This meant that distillers were being taxed on more alcohol than what actually came out of the barrels in the end.
Yeah, and I mean that makes sense. We actually have a old oak barrel that we use as a quench tank in the shop, and whenever we refill it, we actually have to line the whole outside with wet rags and overfill it, and a bunch will spill onto the ground because the oak will absorb it in the sort of the cellulose fibers of the wood and will make the barrel expand. So there's always about 10% of that water ends up just evaporating just when you fill it up. So
which this does remind me, I didn't write this in or anything, but I learned about this whole angel share thing when I was in Ireland, when I went to the Jameson distillery. It was really a neat little tour. And they were like, oh yeah, it literally, the alcohol evaporates out of the barrel, so that we call that the angel's share. That's what the angels are drinking, right? Now, number of years back, and this is a little bit of a burn. I'm not trying to burn you guys too hard or anything, but it's a little bit of a burn. A few years back, I believe it was Jack Daniel's distillery that introduced this thing called the devil's portion. And it was an actual bottle that was, they labeled it as the devil's portion. And literally what they were doing is they sat there and went, dude, we're losing a bunch of spirit to evaporation. So what if we found a way to take that?
Oh.
And they literally were, to my knowledge, I could be a little bit wrong on this, but to my knowledge, they were taking the evaporated alcohol that came out of the barrels and putting that into its own separate label of product. They were calling it the devil's share.
Like a humidity condenser? I wonder how they managed to do that.
I don't know how they managed to do it, but that was what they were doing. And I laughed because I was like, that's kind of like against the tradition, but whatever. I don't care enough.
You know what? Money is money, man.
Hey, no, I had no interest in it, but hey, you guys do.
Yeah, that alcohol cannot be just hanging around in the air. We got to make money off of that.
I actually weirdly get it. It just doesn't interest me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So anyways, whatever. Now, by doing this, by taxing again on the amount of whiskey that went into the barrel, not the amount that came out, essentially, they were being punished for barrel aging their whiskey. Now, thankfully, a champion to the cause of good whiskey, a senator from Kentucky named John G. Carlisle, fought to change the tax code and only tax on the amount of whiskey that came out of a fully aged barrel. Eventually, Carlisle would push his cause even further, and in 1897, quite a ways up the road from where we are in our story, the Bottle and Bond Act was ratified, which gave even further tax incentives to distillers and encouraged accurate reporting, along with more consistent quality to the product. The criteria for a spirit to be legally defined as bottle in bond are as follows, and this is to this day, by the way. Bottle and Bond still exists.
Gotcha.
Number 1, the spirit must be the product of one distillation season. Number 2, it must be made by one distiller at one distillery. Number 3, it must be bottled and stored in federally bonded warehouses under the U.S. government supervision for no less than 4 years, and that later increased to 8 years. And number 4, the bottled product's label must identify the distillery by DSP, which is like a serial number, where it was distilled, and, if different, where it was bottled.
Interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, once again, location comes into mind here.
Well, and it was also one of those situations where the government was basically saying, hey, we want to make sure that you're not doing anything wrong, right?
Yeah.
We don't want you to be saying, oh yeah, this is an 8-year barrel aged thing, but we're actually going to cut it with like 2-year-old spirit to stretch out. Like,
Yeah.
And they would do that. Some distillers did that. So the government basically was saying, no, we want to ensure that consumers are actually getting what they're paying for. So our incentive to you is put your barrels in our warehouses for aging. We can monitor them and make sure you're not screwing with them. They're going to bottle them here on site so we can monitor that too. And now everybody in the US as a consumer can trust and know this is not a tampered product.
Yeah.
This is a real, accurate, good bottle of bourbon, basically.
Yeah. And it'd be another 200 years before we had that same attitude about any of our meat or food. I think people cared a little bit more about the whiskey than they wanted to know where the sausage was made.
Probably true. Now, things were starting to change on the governmental level, but it was slow goings. With the current state of affairs being what they were, Jack had little other option than to buckle down and fight to keep his business alive. Luckily, Jack was about as plucky as they come, and as we mentioned in the past episodes, he was a consummate and affable salesman. But Jack was also about to discover that he had an untapped gift for marketing and branding. Now, thankfully, a bit of luck was also on Jack's side, as 1877 saw a massive surplus in corn production, which led to distillers ramping up their production of bourbon. Between 1877 and 1879, Jack saw a sales increase of nearly 250%.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is gigantic.
Once more, bourbon was making its way further and further west, which led to early pioneers developing a passionate taste for corn liquor. Jack was now making a name for himself on a national level. Now, several factors led to Jack's prosperity over the next few years. First, Jack was a multifaceted businessman who not only produced spirits, but also had vast swaths of land, so he was additionally raising livestock and other produce. Second, supply and demand was going up, as the population in the US would increase from 40 million in 1877, or pardon me, not even 1877, 1870, to over 76 million by 1900.
Wow.
That is an
Almost
increase of 36 million people in just 20 years.
That's insane. Well, you know what? That always tends to happen post-war. We had the same thing with the baby boomers now.
It's true. And not only that, but we were still at the point of, we hadn't even really truly hit the point of seeing Irish people immigrate into the United States during the Industrial Revolution and all this kind of stuff. So there were tons and tons of other people from around the world that were saying, hey, let's head to America and get a piece of that action. Right?
Exactly.
But it's totally a great point, too, that it's post-war, I feel like, there's something in the air that's like, things are rebuilding. There's opportunity. And so they flocked here, you know? And lastly, the relationship was finally, if not slowly, starting to mend between the northern and southern states, which meant expanded trade and distribution, in addition to northerners finally letting go of their staunch prejudice and partaking in the libations from the south. Don't get me wrong, southerners were equally as prejudiced against the northerners, if not more so. So just wanted to put that out there. But all of this was good news for Jack. After taxes were paid, Jack found that he was making about $5,000 a year. Might not seem like much, but converted to today's dollars, Jack was making over $150,000 a year.
Ooh, nice. More
Yeah,
than a surgeon. Jeez.
Doing real well for himself. Now, for comparison, the top end of factory worker employment at the time was about $600 per year, equating to about $18,000 in today's currency. So old Jackie boy wasn't doing too bad. And remember, he was only about 30 years old at this point, probably even a little younger.
Oh, that's so frustrating. I'm so mad.
Now, I should also note that through his success, Jack was always generous. After his older sister Betty had lost both of her infant children,
Oh, that is so sad.
Jack allowed her and her husband to stay at his farm for free. But both were too proud, so Betty took over the role of cook and housekeeper while her husband James Connor helped to manage the farm. In 1880, Jack's brother-in-law Felix Motlow came to him in dire straits, asking if he could borrow some money. Jack happily gave him the money, and instead of asking for direct payment, Jack instead asked to farm on 50 acres of Felix's land to produce more corn and wood for his distillery, and that was that.
Wow.
Like, he was just like, yeah, no problem. I just want to make more corn, so if I could just use some of your land to do that, like, you take the money. It's all good.
Yeah, and
like,
all of them always had like a crap ton of land, so what does that
Exactly. The next year, Felix needed to borrow more money. And again, Jack gave it to him happily, only asking for a few pigs in return, along with a bit more land to farm on. Jack only had one condition and would say, quote, "Now, I'll give you money this time, but if I ever hear of your spending your money for that moonshine rot gut whiskey instead of my good whiskey, I'll never give you another cent."
I love that.
Always a businessman, too. Be like, hey, don't you dare buy that crap. Buy my whiskey.
I like how he was not handing out free bottles. That just does not seem like his character.
I'll give you money, but I'm not giving you my whiskey.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, despite all of the hardships that Jack and his siblings faced during their youth, Jack really loved his siblings and all of his nieces and nephews deeply and made special effort to spend as much time with all of them as possible and lend a helping hand where he could. Jack was so beloved by his family that in 1876, his brother Wiley would name his own son Jasper Daniel. And then again in 1889, his sister Nettie would name her youngest son Jack Daniel Motley.
That is so cute.
Isn't that adorable?
I mean, yeah. I mean, when you get good character, you get rewarded with things like that.
You know, and he was just like, yeah, they loved him. They were like, all right, yep, it's happening. That we're going to name our kids after you.
That's so cute.
Even beyond his family, all of Jack's employees held him in such affection that he was known to all as Uncle Jack.
Aww.
So everybody, like, he would walk around the distillery and they'd be like, hey, Uncle Jack, how's it going, bud? Like, he was that kind of guy.
Taking the nearest moniker.
Yeah, like, I think it's adorable. You know?
That's so cute.
However, one dark cloud had been sitting on Jack's horizon and was steadily approaching. Jack's longtime partner, Dan Call, was starting to succumb to the pressures of the Temperance movement, not helped by his devout dedication to the Lutheran Church. Though Dan had always been a massive proponent of drinking in moderation, none of his other Lutheran churchgoers seemed to care. To them, alcohol was the devil's brew. If someone was fired from their job, they blamed whiskey. If someone cheated on their wife, they blamed whiskey. If one dude murdered another dude, they blamed whiskey. Revivalist preachers at the time were known to hold up a small glass of whiskey to their congregation, drop in an earthworm to the glass, watch it die, and then dramatically ask the audience, quote, "Now, my friends, what does this tell us?"
You could do that with soap or
No. This is just some good clean science.
salt water.
I don't know what you're talking about.
or-
This is science at its finest.
Oh,
Akiva.
sorry.
Yeah, if you didn't catch on to that.
Or like if that's the moniker, it's just like you cannot live in a house with anything that would kill an earthworm. I just wonder how we would all live. Just in the dirt? I don't get it.
It is really stupid. It doesn't make if you dropped an earthworm into water, it would die. So, like, what are you talking about, man? Like, don't drink water? Is that's it too? But the thing that really seemed to piss them off the most, a new study was published in 1880, which revealed that drinking establishments, i.e. saloons, bars, and speakeasies, now outnumbered churches 4-1.
Yeah. Because it's more fun.
It is. The study also revealed that distillers outnumbered ministers by a factor of 9, which meant there were 90 distillers for every 10 ministers.
How many ministers do you need for a church, and how many distillers do you need for a distillery? If there was only one of them per distillery, I think there'd be a lot more explosions.
This is all. I didn't even think about that. That's also very, very true. It's like, yeah, because they're a business. I don't know how you're upset about this.
How am I supposed to keep the doors open with just one guy?
But it wasn't just these statistics that riled up the temperance fighters. Reports were coming back from all over the U.S. that saloon keepers were giving free samples of whiskey to children so as to get them accustomed to the taste early. I gotta be honest, my grandpa did that to me with beer.
Yeah. Growing up Jewish, I would always like pretend like I liked the ceremonial wine every Friday. You know, that's just a classic thing of growing up.
It kind of is. I'm not condoning it,
No,
anybody.
please do not.
Don't give your children a bunch of liquor or anything.
Yeah.
And that's what they were doing. They would literally be like, saloon owners out in the West would be like, come on, kids, get your daily nip of whiskey so that we can really get you hooked on it. Like, come on,
Were they actually doing that, or was that just propaganda?
No. They were genuinely doing that.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that was also how my mother grew up, too. When she was a kid, they put a little bit of whiskey on the gums when you're a baby.
That's different. I'm talking about like a 9-year-old walking down the street and them being like, Johnny boy, come here. And then they would be like, here, you want a shot of whiskey? Try this out. And then they would like, laugh when he would cough at it the first time. And then the next day they'd be like, hey, come on, try it again. And
okay, yeah, that is kind of fucked up.
Yeah, try to get them hooked on it.
I mean, they also still had jobs at factories where they'd get like their arms like, ripped off in a cotton gin. So,
they might have needed a drink.
There are like, it's not exactly like they were coming home from school. They were coming home from the forge.
That is true. Now, way out west, in places like Denver, Colorado, and Taos, New Mexico, which are the 2 cities that were listed in my research, by the way. I'm not just pulling these out of my butt.
That's so cool.
Every time, I can't, if anybody that's a longtime listener of this show, I can't get away from Taos. Taos, New Mexico keeps popping up every single time I do any kind of research. It's like it's always there. I don't know what it is. But anyhow,
if you haven't listened to the Mabel Dodge series, please do so. It is so cool.
It's a fun one, I gotta say. I really enjoyed doing that series. But again, in places like Denver and Taos, barkeepers were adding all sorts of enhancements to their whiskey in an attempt to stretch out its value. Whatever they were adding apparently gave anyone who consumed it such severe shakes that they couldn't even hold their glass after a few shots.
Cocaine, maybe? I don't know.
I would imagine it was something way worse because it was like they wanted to stretch it out with liquid and they wanted it to not. I would imagine it would be something like bleach or I don't even know what else. What am I thinking of? What's ammonia or something like that? Like something to really mess you up.
Yeah, because if it killed an earthworm, then it's also whiskey. And that's how you can tell if someone's a witch because they can float, and that means that they're made out of wood.
More good, clean science. Now, Dan Call started to really feel the pressure most prominently applied by his wife, Mary Jane, who is gravely concerned about their children's salvation while being raised, basically, in a distillery. For Dan, the choice was becoming clear. Quit the business, or keep going with Jack, go against his family, his friends, and his church, all for the sake of the devil's liquid. Now, somewhere between 1877, or somewhere, let's say around 1877, Dan stopped participating in day-to-day distilling operations and leased the land on which the distillery was located back to Jack. By 1882, Dan was completely out of the whiskey business. Jack was now on his own, which meant that the name Daniel and Call Distillery no longer made sense. It was now officially time for Jack Daniel to rebrand.
Honestly, more room for him.
And that's where we'll pick back up for part 4 of Jack Daniel.
This is getting exciting. He's becoming the business mogul.
He's becoming the man. It's like before it was technically, you could say he was a business partner in the ownership of his distillery. Now he is officially on his own.
The real
he
McCoy.
Is literally going to, which by the way, do you know where the real McCoy came from?
Yes, I do. It's a engineering sort of oil dripper, which actually the McCoy dripper we actually, I believe, have on the Nasal Power Hammer in the shop.
I could be wrong about this.
Okay.
And I will happily accept if I am, because I like to know the truth about these things. What I had heard was that during the days of Prohibition in American 1920s, there was so many cases of people watering down whiskeys. One of the few that was doing it was a distiller named McCoy. So when people would taste it and it would be full-bodied and delicious, they'd go, there's the real McCoy.
Interesting.
That's what I heard. I
we'll
could
have
be
to
wrong.
look it up and have it ready for the next episode.
We'll look this one up. So forgive me, people, if that was if you listened and went, no, Akiva was right. I will gladly concede to that.
I could also be wrong. My thought was that it was for a lubricating system that they use for locomotives and all sorts of different steam machines.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
I want to look it up now. And I bet you anything we're going to look it up and go, oh, we're going to do a series on this guy.
Yeah, Henry Recoil, actually kind of interesting dude. From what I know, he was a African American who became a train engineer and then invented this oiling system.
That sounds way more accurate than me. Mine sounds like an urban legend. Yours sounds like based on research.
This could be considered what my wife would call an Akiva fact, which is I know something and I'm very confident, so I'm just going to say it like it's fact. So we'll see.
Thing. I do the exact same thing. So you're in good company. Well, everybody, that was episode 3 of Jack Daniel. Hope y'all enjoyed. Before we get going here, we'll give a couple little shout outs or whatever, I guess, or just mention a few things. Like always, everybody go check out Akiva's website, metalworkbymiola.com. We're talking about gorgeous, beautiful, amazing, handmade chef's knives. And I'm sure if you asked very nicely, many other types of knives as well. If you want a sword, he could probably make you a sweet sword.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any type of that kind of stuff. So again, go check out his website, Metalwork by Miola. You can use the code biographers at checkout. You're going to get 10% off of your order as well.
That 10% can be pretty solid depending on what knife you're getting.
Absolutely. Yeah, he does not make cheap knives, so don't think you're going to go get like a $75 Henkel's. If you want one of those, go to Walmart. If you want something handmade out of carbon steel that will, slice off your fingers if you're not careful with it, in a good way, be careful when you're cooking, everybody. But that's the type of knives that he's going to be making. So go check that out. You have planted in my head that I need to always give shout outs to social media Sturf.
Yes, absolutely.
So I'm going to do that now. Or you go ahead, buddy.
Yeah,
you're better at
it. Follow us on Instagram, on TikTok, The Biographers.
I just revamped our YouTube page as well. So I've put all of our episodes onto YouTube. I've put them into an actual podcast section. There's podcast listings on YouTube. They're all in playlists too. So you can just go to Ian Fleming and it'll start you at part 1 and just take you down through the entire series. That's great. I've done that with all of the other ones so far. Abigail Adams too. So go check those out. They're going to be up on YouTube. What else?
I think that's it for me, unless you got anything else cooking.
I don't think so. Again, for anybody that has not figured it out yet, we have switched formats to being more hour-long episodes once per week rather than 2 hours every 2 weeks. So I hope y'all are enjoying that. Hope it's a little bit more digestible for everybody.
Also, if you guys have any corrections or suggestions, feel free to shoot us an email at thebiographers@gmail.com.
Biographers Podcast.
Biographers Podcast at Gmail. If you want to be annoying, we'd love that. If you guys have suggestions for folks that we should do next, also reach out.
Yeah, my friend Charlotte, who I love dearly. She's a lovely, lovely gal. She actually sent me a recommendation on a person the other day as well. So again, always welcome to hear that kind of stuff. Or if y'all just want to say hello and say, whatever you want to say. I would love to chat with you and, connect a little bit here.
100%.
So. Well, I think that's going to do it, everybody. Thanks for listening. And I will say, which I guess is my new little catchphrase at the end of this, at least I'm thinking it might just be, remember, ignorance is not stupidity. It is the absence of knowledge. And I do hope you all learned something today. So with that, we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to The Biographers. For more information, please visit thebiographerspodcast.com.